Puddles in the playground. Someone in the sky is having a cry. There's a flood of falling tears. There are puddles in the playground. It hasn't rained like this for years. So it's a wet playtime we're having. We're not going out to play. We'd like to shout and run about, but in we've got to stay. It's wet, 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 wet. And still the rain comes sloshing down on roof, on field, on head, on flower bed, on garden shed, and guess what? It's wet. Wet, 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 wet. Water's gurgling through the gutters, gushing down the drains, all morning, during lessons, rain striking window panes. So it's a wet lunchtime we're having. We can't go wild today. After our meal it's back to school, in we've got to stay. Then the afternoon drags on and on and on and on and on. And halfway through, when break is due, the classroom's still our prison. And it's a wet playtime we're having. We're not going out to play. We'd like to shout and run about, but in we've got to stay. Because it's rained, we've been restrained, captives in a cell. We've been restrained because it's rained, confined till the last bell. Now it's a wet home time we're having. We've energy to spare. Let's make a dash, let's cause a splash. But what's this that we hear? No, you can't go out, because without a doubt it's far too damp out there. It's wet, 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 wet. Says who? Says Mum. Oh. In bed we'll dream of raindrops once we fall asleep, of gurglings and gushings, fish faces rising from the deep. We'll be tossing, we'll be turning, we'll have water on the brain, and through our minds will trickle this soggy, sad refrain. It's wet, 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 wet. So wet, 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 wet.